Open the gates to a storage where the dust of ages rests upon the scrolls of truth, and silence guards the voices of those whose stories have been twisted, rewritten, or simply forgotten. I am your guide through these shadowy corridors, the keeper of the forgotten archives. We often think of history as a frozen painting, chiseled in stone, but that's a lie. History is a river, shaped by the victors, its waters muddied by rumors and legends. Today, we're setting off on a journey to three great civilizations: Mesopotamia, Japan, and the Celts. And we'll peel back the layers on 30 myths you've accepted as truth. This won't just be a retelling of facts. We will hear the creak of clay tablets beneath the scribe's stylus, feel the chill of a samurai's steel blade, and breathe in the damp air of misty Celtic valleys. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew, and I promise, by the end of our journey, you'll never look at history in the same trusting way again. Myth number 1, the heavenly staircase of the dead, or why the ziggurats of Mesopotamia are not tombs. Mesopotamia. Picture an endless sun-scorched plain in the land between rivers. The air shimmers with heat, and the horizon seems infinite. And in the midst of this flat world, like a challenge to the gods themselves, rises a gigantic stepped mountain made of millions of clay bricks. This is a ziggurat. For centuries, as we gazed at these colossal structures, we made the most obvious comparison. We recalled another great river civilization, Egypt, and its pyramids. The logic seemed solid. If pharaohs built grand tombs to secure eternal life, then the mighty kings of Ur, Babylon, and Akkad must have done the same. This idea became so deeply rooted that it was almost a given. In school textbooks, in adventure novels, and the minds of millions, the ziggurat became synonymous with a royal tomb, the Mesopotamian answer to the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Its massive walls were thought to conceal sarcophagi full of gold and curses for anyone daring to disturb the eternal rest of an ancient ruler. People believed this because it was simple and clear. Great ruler, great tomb. A monument to vanity that reaches into eternity. And no one asked the question, what if we have been looking at a marvel of engineering all along, but completely misunderstood its true, astonishing purpose? What if this wasn't a house for the dead, but a gateway for living gods? The climax of this misconception hits when we ask archaeologists a simple question. How many royal burials have been found inside ziggurats? And the answer is shocking in its emptiness. None. Not a single one. Throughout all the excavations of these giant structures, no sarcophagi, no burial chambers, no mummies have been discovered, nothing indicating a burial purpose. The truth turned out to be far more fantastic and far less selfish than the myth of royal pride. The ziggurat was not a tomb. It was a home for a god on earth. In the worldview of the Sumerians and Akkadians, gods dwelled in the heavens, atop distant, inaccessible mountains. But cities needed their constant presence, their protection, and their blessings. So the people decided to build an artificial mountain right in the center of their city for their divine patrons. The ziggurat was literally a stairway to the heavens, a point where worlds met. At its top stood a small temple, a sacred sanctuary, richly decorated and furnished like a true home. The priests believed that this was where the deity, the moon god Nana in Ur, or the great Marduk in Babylon, descended from the heavens to rest, accept offerings, and communicate with their servants. This was not a place of mourning and silence, but a hub of vibrant religious life. Processions of priests would ascend its steps, carrying delicacies, incense, and precious gifts. At its base sprawled a vast temple complex, where records were kept, scribes were trained, and grain was stored. The ziggurat was the heart of the city, pulsing to the rhythm of sacred rituals, not a lifeless stone holding the ashes of a single person. The true royal tombs of Mesopotamia, like the lavish burials in the royal cemetery of Ur, lay underground, separate from the temple complexes. This myth lasted so long because we judged ancient civilization by our standards, forgetting that their world operated entirely differently. They didn't build to immortalize the memory of a mortal king, but to establish a fragile yet vital connection with the immortal and powerful forces that govern their fates. Thus, The greatest monuments of Mesopotamia turned out to be not memorials of death, but monuments of desperate hope for life and divine mercy. From those sunlit brick mountains built for communication with the heavens, our journey leads east, to islands shrouded in mist and steel, where the myth of the warrior proved stronger than his own sword, and where the human soul found its reflection not in the weapons we typically think of. Myth number 2. The soul of the samurai, or the myth of the omnipotent sword, Japan. Close your eyes and picture a samurai. What image comes to mind first? It's probably a lone warrior in armor standing beneath a branch of blooming cherry blossoms. His hand rests on the hilt of a long, elegantly curved sword, the katana. In movies, literature, and our collective consciousness, the samurai and katana are inseparable. The sword isn't just a weapon, it's the soul of the samurai, an extension of his will, a symbol of his honor. We've heard tales of masters who could slice through a falling silk handkerchief with a single swing, of duels where the fate of clans was decided, of the sacred reverence with which a warrior treated his blade. This image is incredibly appealing. It speaks of individual mastery, of a spiritual connection with the weapon, of combat as the highest form of the art of war. We believed in this myth because it's romantic and simple. It transforms brutal slaughter. But the battlefield is not a movie set, and its rules are far more mundane and unforgiving. Now, open your eyes and picture a real battlefield from the Sengoku era, the time of the warring states. It's not a blooming garden, but a mess of mud and blood. Hundreds, thousands of warriors clash in fierce combat. Arrows whistle through the air, cavalry tramples foot soldiers, and long spears create an impenetrable wall. And where do you see a samurai with his legendary katana in this war-torn hell? At best, in the third row. Because the truth behind the shine of polished steel is that the katana was never the primary weapon of the samurai on the battlefield. It was a secondary weapon, a personal one, a symbol of status, but not the main tool for victory. For centuries, the main strength and pride of the samurai, especially in the earlier periods, was the bow, yumi. The art of the warrior was originally called the way of the horse and bow. The samurai was primarily an elite mounted archer, capable of hitting targets with incredible precision while on the move. As armies grew larger and battles became more extensive, another weapon took the spotlight, the spear, or yari. This long spear allowed warriors to keep enemies at bay, fight effectively in formation, and counter cavalry. It was the spears that determined the outcome of most great battles. The katana only came into play when the main weapon was broken or lost, or in close quarters, where spears or bows had no room. It was like a modern soldier's last resort weapon or personal self-defense tool. So where did this all-consuming myth about the sword come from? It blossomed during the peaceful Edo period, when the Tokugawa shogunate unified the country, bringing nearly 300 years of peace. Samurai transformed from warriors into administrators, officials, and nobles. Battles were a distant memory, and symbolism replaced practicality. It was during this quiet time that the katana evolved from a backup weapon into the main symbol of the samurai class, an object of reverence and philosophical discussions. The myth of the soul of the samurai was born not in the clamor of battle, but in the tranquility of peaceful living, when warriors had nothing left to do but polish their blades and reminisce about past glories. Thus, the most famous symbol of the Japanese warrior was born not from war, but from peace. The legend proves stronger than the harsh reality of the battlefield. Just as peacetime created the myth of the sword, so did the thick mists of European forests obscure the true nature of those we call Celts, replacing the diversity of peoples with a single, fabricated image of a savage painted in blue. Myth number 3. Blue savages. They are a unified, wild, yet noble people fighting against Roman legions with the fury of berserkers. This image, widely spread through movies, books, and even video games, seems to be a solid portrayal of an entire civilization. We believe in it because it's convenient. It creates a clear, understandable archetype of the barbarian, free-spirited, close to nature, standing against the imperial machine of Rome. This picture pulls together scattered tribes from Ireland to Turkey under one recognizable banner. We're used to saying Celtic music, Celtic patterns, Celtic mythology, as though it refers to a single empire with a shared culture, like the Romans or Greeks. We see them as one people, one nation, lost in time. But this monolithic image crumbles into dust as soon as we step away from Roman propaganda texts and turn to archaeology and linguistics. The truth is that there was never a single Celtic people or Celtic empire. That's a complete myth. The term Celts, or Gauls as they were called by the Romans, was an external label that the Greeks and Romans used to describe a vast multitude of completely different, often warring tribes that populated extensive territories in Europe. They didn't share a common name, government, or identity. What we call Celtic today is primarily a linguistic family, a group of related languages, just like Slavic or Germanic languages. The Gauls in modern France, the Galatians in Anatolia, Turkey, and the Scots in Ireland spoke related languages, but their material culture, social structure, and beliefs could differ drastically. It's like calling everyone who speaks Romance languages, from Portuguese to Romanian, one people, Latins. As for the famous image of the warrior painted in blue, it comes from Roman descriptions of the Picts, a specific tribal confederation living in what is now Scotland. Even there, it likely referred to temporary war paint rather than permanent tattoos. Attributing this custom to all Celts, from Ireland to the Danube, is a gross mistake. Most Gallic warriors who fought Caesar went into battle in splendid armor, including the famous chainmail, which, according to one version, they invented. They were skilled metal workers, builders of fortified towns, oppida, and had a complex social structure. The myth of a unified savage people was beneficial to Rome. It simplified the image of the enemy, making it more primitive and less significant, thus justifying conquest. Later, this image was picked up by the Romantics of the 19th century, who created an idealized picture of the noble savage. So behind the single but false facade of the Celts lies an exciting mosaic of dozens of unique peoples, cultures, and histories that have been unjustly erased and replaced by a convenient stereotype. We've debunked the myth of a single people, but what about their laws? From the brutality of the barbarians, we return once more to civilized Mesopotamia to discover that the most famous code of laws in human history isn't quite what we imagine it to be. Myth number 4, an eye for an eye, or the humanity of Hammurabi's bloody code, Mesopotamia. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This phrase, carved into eternity, has come to be synonymous with Mesopotamian justice. When we hear the name of Babylonian king Hammurabi, we immediately picture a stern but fair lawmaker and his legendary code. We think we understand the essence of this law. It's a principle of retribution, of equal justice. If you knock someone's eye out, you'll lose your eye. If you break someone's bone, they'll break yours. This idea seems both harsh and totally fair in its primitive symmetry. It paints a picture of a society where everyone bears literal, physical responsibility for their actions, regardless of their status. We buy into this myth because it's simple, clear, and dramatic. It creates an image of a civilization that, albeit through tough methods, strived for objective justice, where punishment mirrors the crime precisely. This formula has become a catchphrase, embedded in sayings and ingrained in culture as the pinnacle of ancient jurisprudence. We envision a Babylonian judge administering pain for pain, injury for injury, without hesitation. However, once we take a closer look at the text of Hammurabi's famous stela, the myth of universal equality before the punishing law starts to fall apart. The principle of an eye for an eye did exist, but it was far from universal and was applied only in very specific circumstances. Hammurabi's justice was deeply class-based, and the punishment depended not only on the crime itself, but also on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. The code clearly divided society into 3 categories: avilum, full citizens, aristocrats; mushkenim, free but lesser citizens, perhaps dependent on the state; and wardum, slaves. Here's where it gets really interesting. The principle of an eye for an eye applied only if a high-status member, avilum, harmed another avilum. Equality existed only among equals. But if an avilum knocked out the eye of a mushkenim or a slave, There was no reciprocal injury. Instead, the noble offender simply paid a monetary fine. For example, if they knocked out a mushkenam's eye, they had to pay a fine of 1 mina of silver. And if they knocked out a slave's eye, they paid the owner half the market value of that slave. Conversely, if a mushkenam or slave harmed an avilum, the punishment was much harsher, often involving physical penalties that wouldn't be used against the aristocracy for the same offenses. Thus, the famous code served more as a tool for maintaining a strict social hierarchy than a mechanism for equal retribution. Its primary role was to protect the property and privileges of the upper class. The truth is, Hammurabi's justice wasn't blind at all. It was very much aware of who stood before it and handed out punishments based on their social status. The myth of cruel yet fair equality turned out to be a beautiful facade hiding a rigid system of social inequality. This ancient law that we've thought of as a symbol of balanced justice was actually a complex social regulator. From the stone-carved laws, let's travel to the Japanese islands, where unwritten rules of honor and ritual gave birth to one of the darkest and most misunderstood myths, the myth of ritual suicide as an everyday norm of samurai life. Myth number 5. The easy death of a samurai, or why seppuku wasn't commonplace, Japan. The image of a samurai performing seppuku, or harakiri as it's often called in the West, is one of the strongest and most unsettling symbols of Japanese culture. In our minds, it seems almost like a routine ritual. Defeated in battle? Seppuku. Offended your lord? Seppuku. Captured? Seppuku. This act appears to be the ultimate expression of the Bushido Code, the only way to wash away shame and preserve honor. We picture this incredible self-control, a warrior in white garments resolutely plunging a short sword called a wakizashi into his abdomen. This myth is incredibly persistent because it paints a picture of a warrior with an extraordinary level of self-restraint and devotion, for whom honor is worth more than life itself. It transforms samurai into superhumans, unafraid of death, ready to sacrifice themselves at any moment for their ideals. This idea of an easy and inevitable ritual death for any wrongdoing has taken root in the popular consciousness, creating an aura of fatalism and tragic heroism around the samurai class. We believe that hundreds and thousands of samurai unflinchingly chose this path, but reality, as it often is, was much more complex and less dramatic. Seppuku was never a widespread or everyday occurrence. It was an extremely rare, strictly ritualized act, mostly limited to the elite samurai class. A common samurai, an ashigaru, a foot soldier, or a bushi from a poor family likely never witnessed this ritual in their entire life. For one thing, seppuku was not a spontaneous decision. Often it was a form of privileged execution that a shogun or daimyo, lord, granted to a high-ranking samurai who had committed a serious offense instead of a shameful execution by the hands of an executioner. By committing seppuku, a warrior preserved his family's honor, ensuring they would not lose their status or property. It was a way to exit life with dignity, but it was a command, not a free choice. Moreover, the ritual itself was far from the dramatic portrayals in movies. The idea that a samurai alone valiantly disembowels himself is mainly fiction. The process was excruciatingly painful and prolonged. Therefore, a key figure in the ritual was the kai-shakunin, an assistant, usually the samurai's best friend or most skilled swordsman, who stood behind him ready with a sword. At that moment when the person performing seppuku made the cut, the kai-shakunin swiftly beheaded him with a precise strike, freeing him from further suffering. Essentially, this was a ritual beheading, where the symbolic first cut signified readiness and courage. The myth that samurai committed seppuku to avoid capture is greatly exaggerated. Throughout numerous wars, thousands of samurai were taken prisoner, and often they were either exchanged or they pledged loyalty to a new lord. Life was valued, and throwing it away for any reason would have been impractical and foolish. The legend of widespread seppuku, much like the myth of the katana, grew during the peaceful Edo period, becoming part of a heroic past celebrated in plays and stories. Thus, the most dramatic ritual of samurai culture was not a rule but a rare exception, a privilege for the elite wrapped in complex regulations. From the rituals of death, let's shift to the rituals of life in the green lands of the Celts to discover that their most famous spiritual leaders, the Druids, were not at all what we think they were. Myth number 6. Wizards in white robes, or the true role of Celtic Druids. When we hear the word Druid, our imagination conjures up an elder with a long white beard, dressed in a white robe, holding a golden sickle. He stands in the center of a stone circle, like Stonehenge, or in a sacred oak grove, mumbling ancient incantations and predicting the future by the flight of birds or the entrails of animals. The Druid in our minds is a Celtic wizard, a magician, a priest of a mysterious forest cult. This image, largely created by Roman authors and later polished by romantics and modern fantasy, has become an integral part of the Celtic myth. We believe in it because it fills the ancient world with magic and mystery. It transforms Celtic society into something mystical, driven not by laws and politics, but by the forces of nature and the will of the gods, interpreted by their enigmatic servants. The Druid wizard is a convenient and vivid archetype that fits perfectly into the picture of a wild and natural Celtic civilization. However, if we strip away these fantastic layers and analyze the few reliable accounts, we get a completely different picture. Druids did exist, and they held significant influence, but their primary role in society was not magical but intellectual and social. Druids were not so much wizards as the intellectual elite of the Celtic world. They were the keepers of knowledge in a non-literate society. Imagine a single figure combining the roles of judge, lawyer, teacher, historian, diplomat, and philosopher. They were the ones who settled disputes between tribes and individuals, and their decisions were final. They acted as emissaries and negotiated, sometimes halting battles simply by their presence between the armies. They were mentors to the youth from noble families, and studying with them could last up to 20 years, during which students memorized vast amounts of sacred texts, laws, genealogies, and poems. They were the living libraries of their people. Yes, they also served as priests, leading rituals and sacrifices, but that was just one side of their role. Their power didn't come from a fear of the supernatural, but from their monopoly on knowledge and law. The Romans, especially Julius Caesar, understood perfectly well that the Druids were the ideological backbone of Gallic society. They maintained unity and the spirit of resistance. Therefore, one of the main goals of the Romans in Gaul and Britain was the deliberate destruction of the Druid class. By wiping them out, Rome was erasing the memory, law, and very identity of the conquered peoples. As for the white robes and golden sickles used for gathering mistletoe, that description by Pliny the Elder refers to one specific ritual and has been mistakenly generalized to all Druid activities. Their connection to Stonehenge is even more of an anachronism. This megalithic monument was built over 1,000 years before the Celts arrived in Britain. So, Druids were not the wizards from fairy tales, but a powerful intellectual and political force, the glue that held Celtic society together. From the keepers of oral laws, we return to Mesopotamia, where laws were written on clay, to unravel the myth of the very first work in human history and its true meaning. Myth number 7. The tale of the lone hero, or why the Epic of Gilgamesh is not just one man's story, Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest literary work known to us. It's the story of a mighty king of the city of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 human. In our minds, this story has settled as the classic heroic epic, the prototype for all the following tales about great heroes. We see Gilgamesh as an ancient Hercules, a demigod performing incredible feats, defeating monsters and challenging the gods themselves. The central theme of the epic seems to be his personal drama, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, their shared adventures, the sorrow over the loss of a friend, and finally the desperate, selfish quest for immortality. We read this poem as a narrative of an individual journey, of personal development, and of the tragedy of a mortal realizing his own finiteness. This interpretation resonates with modern individuals, raised in a culture of individualism. We believe in this myth because it transforms an ancient, foreign text into a universal story about human passions, friendship, and the fear of death. This makes Gilgamesh relatable to us, almost a contemporary figure. However, this interpretation, focused solely on the king's personality, overlooks the deeper meanings that were clear to an ancient Mesopotamian but are hidden from us. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a story about a man. It's a fundamental myth about civilization, about the contrast between savagery and culture, nature and city. The key to understanding lies not only in Gilgamesh but also in his counterpart, Enkidu. Enkidu starts off as a wild being. He lives in harmony with nature, knows no clothing, eats grass, and drinks water from rivers along with the animals. He is the embodiment of humanity's primal, pre-civilization state. And here's the turning point of the epic. It's not a battle with a monster, but the civilizing of Enkidu. He's introduced to a woman, to bread and beer, the key markers of civilized life. After experiencing these, he loses his connection to the animal world, and the beasts begin to fear him. He becomes human. His friendship with Gilgamesh symbolizes the union of two aspects of human existence: untamed natural power, Enkidu, and organized urban culture, Gilgamesh. Their shared feats, like the slaying of the monster Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, are not just heroic acts, but a metaphor for humanity's conquest over wild, hostile nature, the clearing of forests to build cities and temples. Gilgamesh's subsequent journey, his quest for immortality, isn't just a personal tragedy. It reflects the entire Mesopotamian civilization's contemplation on the meaning of human life, and the answer that Gilgamesh finds in the end is astounding. He doesn't achieve eternal life. Instead, he returns to his home in Uruk and admires its walls that he built. The wisdom he gains is that true immortality lies not in the body, but in one's deeds, in what is left behind. For the Mesopotamian king, this meant the cities, temples, and canals he constructed. The epic teaches that greatness isn't in conquering death, but in serving society and civilization. Thus, the story we thought was a personal drama turns out to be a deep allegory for the emergence of human society. From the myths inscribed on clay, we now move to Japan, where myths were created not through words, but through actions, and we'll discover that the most famous and mysterious warriors of this land, the ninjas, were not at all like how popular culture depicts them. Myth number 8, the invisible killers in black, or who ninjas really were, Japan. It's night. A shadow silently lands on the tiled roof of a Japanese castle. A figure, clad from head to toe in a black skin-tight suit that hides everything but the eyes. In their hands, they hold shuriken, and a straight sword rests on their back. This is a ninja, the elusive spy and hired assassin, a master of disguise and deadly arts. This image is familiar to everyone. Movies, comics, and games have created a canonical portrait of the ninja as a member of a secret clan of professional assassins with nearly supernatural abilities. They walk on water, disappear in a cloud of smoke, kill with a single touch, and serve mysterious forces pulling the strings of history. We believe this myth because it captivates us. It offers a world of secret wars, hidden techniques, and elite warriors standing outside the samurai code of honor. Ninjas are the perfect anti-hero, the dark counterpart to the noble samurai, operating from the shadows. But if we delve into real historical records, this mystical image begins to dissolve like smoke from a smoke bomb. The truth is that ninjas, as we know them, are largely a product of folklore and theatrical arts that blossomed during the peaceful Edo period. In reality, the people who performed the roles we associate with ninjas were known by different names, like shinobi, and they were far from romanticized figures. They were spies, saboteurs, and scouts, hired by feudal lords or daimyo during wars. Their main job wasn't just assassination, but gathering intelligence, sabotaging supplies, spreading misinformation, and creating panic behind enemy lines. Their strength lied not in mystical techniques, but in the arts of deception and disguise. The ideal shinobi wasn't a warrior dressed in black. They were someone who could blend in as a wandering monk, a merchant, a farmer, or even an actor. Their goal was to infiltrate, gather information, and leave unnoticed. They avoided confrontation at all costs, seeking to stay out of trouble. The iconic black outfit, known as shinobi shozoku, is largely a creation of kabuki theater. On stage, the workers moving scenery wore black so that the audience wouldn't notice them. When a invisible ninja appeared in a play, they were dressed similarly for consistency. In reality, shinobi would prefer dark blue or brown clothing for nighttime missions since it blended better with the night sky than pure black. The idea of a ninjato, a straight sword used by ninjas, is mostly a Hollywood myth. There's hardly any historical evidence of its existence. Shinobi used regular weapons of their time, or specially designed tools disguised as farming equipment. The very notion of large secret ninja clans passing down their knowledge through generations is also greatly exaggerated. Yes, there were specific regions like Iga and Koka where the locals were known for their espionage and guerrilla warfare skills, often hired by daimyo. But these were more like professional communities than mystical orders, so the real ninja was not a supernatural assassin, but a pragmatic master of espionage, whose main weapons were not swords, but cunning and intelligence. From Masters of Deception, we'll take a trip to foggy Ireland to debunk one of the most enduring myths about its patron saint and his main achievement. Myth number 9, the banishment of snakes, or what St. Patrick actually did for Ireland. The Celts. St. Patrick's Day. All around the world, people wear green, drink beer, and celebrate. At the heart of this celebration is one of the most famous legends in the Christian world, the story of how St. Patrick drove all the snakes off the Emerald Isle. This story is simple, vivid, and magical. We picture the saint standing atop a hill, using the power of his faith and his staff to cast out hordes of hissing reptiles into the sea, forever cleansing the land of Ireland from this plague. This myth has become central to the image of St. Patrick. It symbolizes the victory of good over evil and Christianity over paganism, since snakes are often associated with the devil or ancient chthonic cults. We believe in this legend because it transforms the complex historical process of Christianization into a single, bright, and memorable heroic act. This is a story that's easy to grasp and share. However, as lovely as this legend may be, it falls apart when it collides with the basics of paleontology and geology. The truth is that St. Patrick couldn't have driven snakes out of Ireland for one very simple reason. They never existed there. Ireland, much like New Zealand or Greenland, is an island that lacks native snake species. During the last ice age, Ireland was covered in a thick layer of ice, making it impossible for any reptiles to survive. When the glaciers receded around 10,000 years ago, the sea levels rose, cutting Ireland off from Britain and mainland Europe before any snakes, slowly migrating north with the retreating cold, could make their way there. The only native reptile in Ireland is the viviparous lizard. So Patrick, in the 5th century AD, simply couldn't have encountered a single snake on the island to drive it out. So where did this incredibly resilient legend come from? Most historians agree that this story is an allegory. The snakes in this context aren't actual reptiles, but rather a symbol of pagan beliefs and practices, particularly Druidism, which thrived in Ireland before Christianity arrived. Some pagan symbols and deities might have had snake-like features. Thus, the driving out of snakes is a metaphorical way of describing Patrick and his followers' efforts to supplant and replace ancient pagan cults with the new Christian faith. It wasn't a battle between humans and animals, but a long and complex process of cultural and religious transformation. The legend emerged centuries after Patrick's death, during the Middle Ages, when there was a need to create a simple and relatable image that illustrated his greatest feat, bringing Christianity to Ireland. The myth of the snakes turned out to be the perfect solution. It was bright, miraculous, and easy for the congregation to remember. So, the main miracle of St. Patrick wasn't zoological, but cultural. He didn't rid the island of non-existent snakes, but he forever changed its spiritual landscape. From myths about saints, we now turn to myths about sinners, back to ancient Babylon, to clear up misunderstandings about its most famous and scandalous structure, the Tower of Babel. Myth number 10, the Tower of Pride, or the true purpose of the Tower of Babel, Mesopotamia. The Tower of Babel. Even those who have never read the Bible know this story. Driven by pride, people decided to build a tower that reached the heavens to match God. In punishment for this audacity, God confused their languages they could not read it into. He explains the diversity of languages and cultures as a result of divine anger. This story has shaped our view of ancient Babylon for thousands of years, portraying it as a hub of evil and rebellion against the gods. But what if we looked at this story not through the eyes of the ancient Jews, who saw Babylon as a powerful and cruel enemy, but from the perspective of the Babylonians themselves? A historical model for the Tower of Babel was undoubtedly the great ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, dedicated to the supreme god of Babylon, Marduk. For the people of the city, this structure had nothing to do with pride or defiance against the gods. On the contrary, it was an act of great piety. As we already know from the myth of ziggurats, these towers were not built to reach the heavens and overthrow the gods, but to create a comfortable space for the gods to descend to earth. It was not an assault on a heavenly fortress, but an invitation for a visit. The Babylonians believed that by building a magnificent home for Marduk, connecting earth and sky, they would ensure his protection and favor. For them, Etemenanki was not a symbol of pride, but the center of the universe, a cosmic axis, a point of stability in a chaotic world. It was a place where divine order manifested on earth. Constructing and maintaining the ziggurat properly was seen as a sacred duty for kings. Rulers like Nebuchadnezzar II proudly declared in their inscriptions not that they challenged the heavens, but that they piously restored and adorned the house of the great Marduk so he could rejoice and bless their city. The biblical story likely emerged during the Babylonian exile when the Jews, forcibly relocated to Babylon, saw this grand, unfamiliar pagan temple and tried to understand it within their monotheistic worldview. For them, this massive structure dedicated to a foreign god could only represent devilish pride. And the many languages of Babylon, which was the largest metropolis in the world at that time, where the speech of dozens of nations echoed, served as the foundation for the tale of the mixing of languages. Thus, a structure that in one culture was considered the pinnacle of piety became a symbol of mortal sin in another. The story of the Tower of Babel is a striking example of how the perspective of the victor, or in this case, the surviving cultural tradition, shapes historical memory. From distorted images of architecture, we will move on to distorted images of power in faraway Japan, to understand that the most important person in the country for centuries was not who they seemed to be. Myth number 11, the golden cage of the chrysanthemum throne, or why the Emperor of Japan didn't rule for centuries. Japan. Imagine a throne of the ancient sun. Sitting on it is the Tenno, heavenly sovereign, a living god, a direct descendant of the great sun goddess Amaterasu. His persona is sacred, his palace is a forbidden city, and his word is law, beyond question. This is the image of the Japanese emperor that has been projected to the outside world for centuries and reached its peak in the 20th century. In this image lies the essence of the divine origin of the Japanese nation, its uniqueness, and the stability of its world order. We believe in this myth of the absolute theocratic power of the emperor, because it is the spiritual foundation of Shinto state ideology. It's simple, monumental, and explains the incredible loyalty and self-sacrifice that the Japanese have shown for their sovereign. Throughout Japanese history, it seems that the emperor has been the central figure, the alpha and omega, an all-powerful ruler holding the fates of millions in his hands. But as we gently peel back the layers of this divine myth, we see not an all-powerful monarch, but rather a high priest, a prisoner of his own status, confined in a golden cage of rituals. The truth is that for most of its history, almost 1,000 years, from the peak of the Heian period to the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, the Emperor of Japan held virtually no real political power. He was a symbol, but not a ruler. Real power lay in the hands of others. At first, it was the cunning aristocrats from the Fujiwara clan, who by marrying their daughters to emperors, became regents for young heirs and effectively ruled the country from behind the throne. Then, from the 12th century onward, power shifted to the military class. The true rulers of Japan became the shoguns, military dictators who governed the country from their headquarters in Kamakura, or Edo, what we now call Tokyo. And what of the emperor? He lived in his capital Kyoto in seclusion and luxury, but his life was not devoted to governing the state. It was tethered to an endless cycle of complex and exhausting Shinto rituals. He was responsible for ensuring the timely change of seasons, a good rice harvest, protection against earthquakes and epidemics. He was the spiritual anchor of the nation, its main intermediary in communication with the gods, but not a political leader. His divinity was an incredibly convenient tool for the shoguns. They ruled not in their own name, but in the name of the emperor, using his sacred authority to legitimize their own power. The emperor himself was so far removed from real life that he sometimes didn't even have his own money, relying entirely on the allowance provided to him by the shogun. The myth of the all-powerful emperor was deliberately revived and inflated at the end of the 19th century, when a group of ambitious samurai overthrew the shogunate. They carried out a revolution under the banner of restoring the emperor's power, but in reality they simply used him as a powerful symbol to unite the nation and push for rapid modernization. Thus, the most sacred symbol of power turned out to be the most powerless holder of it. From this figure, whose authority was merely a myth, we shift to the misty Celtic lands to break down the myth of their most famous warriors, whose image on the battlefield has been similarly mythologized. Myth number 12. Naked Fury, or the lie about Celtic warriors fighting bear. Celts. A Roman legionary stands in formation, gripping his pilum. On the other side of the field, a chilling, unhuman wail echoes. A horde of warriors bursts from the forest. They are Celts. Tall, long-haired, with wild mustaches. But that's not the scariest part. They are completely naked. Their bodies are adorned with blue patterns, left unprotected. In their hands, they wield massive swords and shields. They beat their chests and roar, challenging the disciplined ranks of the legions. This image is one of the most vivid and terrifying in ancient history. The picture of a naked Celtic warrior fighting fiercely is deeply embedded in our minds. It portrays a people who relied not on tactics and armor, but on raw fury, animalistic force, and supernatural bravery. We buy into this myth because it is incredibly cinematic. It creates a perfect contrast between the civilized Romans and the savage barbarian Europe. This image, described by ancient authors like Polybius, seems like undeniable proof of the difference and fierceness of the Celts. However, this image, while based on real events, is a gross oversimplification that distorts the truth about Celtic warfare. The practice of fighting naked did exist, but it was neither widespread nor typical for all Celtic tribes. It was a specific tactic applied by certain elite groups of warriors, referred to as geisatois. They were likely mercenaries from the alpine regions of Gaul, famous for their fearlessness. Their nudity on the battlefield served several purposes. First of all, it was a powerful act of psychological warfare. The sight of bare, roaring warriors, unafraid of wounds or death, was intended to instill terror in the hearts of their opponents. Secondly, it was a demonstration of absolute confidence in their strength and bravery. The warrior seemed to say, "I don't need armor. My valor is my only protection." Perhaps it also had a ritual significance, placing the warrior under the protection of the gods. But the vast majority of Gallic, British, or Iberian warriors that Rome encountered were well equipped. Archaeology leaves no doubt about this. We discover thousands of artifacts, intricately crafted helmets, including the famous horned ones, which were ceremonial rather than battle-ready, shields, long swords, and most importantly, chainmail. Many historians believe that the Celts were the ones who invented chainmail, which the Romans later adopted and improved. A typical Celtic warrior from a noble lineage went into battle in armor that was comparable to Roman gear. In contrast, Roman historians and generals, writing about their wars, deliberately emphasized the exotic and shocking customs of the geisatoi. Why? Because it fueled their propaganda. Tales of naked savages perfectly highlighted the barbaric nature of the enemy and justified Rome's civilizing mission. They took a rare, albeit striking phenomenon and presented it as the norm for all Celts. So, behind the myth of savages relying solely on rage, there were skilled and well-armed warriors. From warriors who strategically used fear, We shift back to Mesopotamia, where a different kind of fear, fear of the gods, seems to have shaped the entire lives of people. But this fear turned out to be a myth as well. Myth number 13, Slaves of the Gods, or Why Mesopotamian Religion Wasn't a Cult of Fear and Despair, Mesopotamia. Picture the world of ancient Sumer and Akkad. Imagine a person living on this land. Their life is fragile and unpredictable. The rivers that provide life can suddenly become raging torrents, sweeping away cities and crops. Drought can scorch the harvest, and enemy raids can destroy everything they have built. And above it all looms a pantheon of fearsome, capricious gods who often seem indifferent to human suffering. We've been taught that Mesopotamian religion reflected this harsh reality. It was a faith rooted in total pessimism. According to the creation myth, people were made from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, with only one purpose: to be slaves to the gods, to toil for them, to feed and please them, expecting nothing in return. And after death, both the righteous and the wicked face the same dreary fate, a grim, dusty underworld, the land of no return. This image paints a picture of a civilization paralyzed by fear, living in eternal dread of divine wrath, without any hope of salvation. We believe this narrative because it seems perfectly logical. A hard life breeds a bleak faith. But this portrayal, painted with only dark colors, is a profound misunderstanding. Yes, the gods of Mesopotamia were powerful and sometimes dangerous, but the relationship between them and humans was far more complex than that of master and slave. It was more like a unique partnership. People served the gods by building them temples or houses and offering sacrifices or food. But this wasn't a one-way obligation. In return, people expected and demanded specific things from the gods: protection of the city, fertility of the fields, health for their families, and success in their endeavors. Religion was deeply pragmatic. Rituals and prayers weren't just desperate acts of submission. They were ways to maintain cosmic order and ensure well-being. Every city had its patron deity, considered its true king or queen. The residents held their guardian god with love and respect, much like a father or protector. Thousands of clay tablets with hymns and personal prayers have survived, filled not only with fear but with tenderness, trust, requests for personal guidance and help. People named their children things like Sin my judge or Ishtar my joy, which doesn't quite align with the image of eternally frightened slaves. And the grim afterlife wasn't a place of punishment like a Christian hell. It was simply a statement of fact. Life after death is just a shadow of earthly existence. So the focus was all about living a worthy and successful life here and now, in this world. It was a religion aimed at sustaining life and order in society, not at passively waiting for a dreadful fate. The religion we once thought was a cult of despair actually turned out to be a religion of active hope. From pragmatic relationships with gods, let's take a trip to Japan, where the connection with beauty birthed a myth that's just as profound, yet often misunderstood in the West. Myth number 14, The Aesthetics of Emptiness, or How the West Twisted the True Meaning of Wabi-sabi, Japan. Wabi-sabi. These two words, when combined, sound like a spell to Western ears, unlocking the door to the world of refined Japanese aesthetics. We instantly picture minimalist interiors, raw wood, rustic ceramics, asymmetry, and a crack in a teacup filled with gold lacquer. Wabi-sabi has become a trendy brand, synonymous with simplicity, humility, and the beauty of imperfection. We're told it's the key to understanding the Japanese soul, a philosophy that teaches us to find charm in the fleeting, in aging, and in the marks left by time. We imagine a wise person in a secluded hut, reaching enlightenment as they contemplate a moss-covered stone. We believe this myth because it offers a beautiful and profound alternative to our Western culture of consumption and the relentless chase for perfection. It perfectly fits our romantic image of a spiritual and mysterious Japan. But this popular Western version of wabi-sabi is nothing more than a pretty postcard pulled from the vast and complex album of Japanese culture. To present wabi-sabi as an all-encompassing aesthetic code for Japan is a significant mistake. For centuries, Japanese aesthetics have been incredibly diverse, often leaning toward the exact opposite: brightness, opulence, luxury, and flawless symmetry. Think about vibrant layered kimonos, shimmering gold screens, intricate carvings, and the riot of colors found in the temples of Nikko. All of this is also part of Japanese aesthetics, and it has nothing to do with austerity. Wabi-sabi isn't mainstream, it's more like a counterculture. This aesthetic concept was born and shaped in a very specific environment among tea ceremony masters during the 15th and 16th centuries, the most famous of which was Sen no Rikyu. This was their conscious response to the ostentatious luxury and expense reigning among samurai warriors and the aristocracy of that time. They contrasted expensive Chinese tea sets with simple, handcrafted local pottery, and lavish palaces with modest tea houses reminiscent of peasant huts. To claim that all of Japanese culture is based on wabi-sabi is like saying that all Western architecture is just stark Gothic cathedrals. The West, enchanted by the surface, the cracks and wear, often misses the point. Wabi-sabi isn't a design style. It's a deeply personal, meditative experience tied to the awareness of life's fleeting nature and the ability to find quiet, profound joy and peace in that transience. It's a feeling, not a set of rules for decorators. So, a profound philosophical concept has been reduced to a superficial trend. From the myth of the aesthetics of an entire nation, let's turn to the Celts to debunk an even more fundamental myth: the myth about their appearance and racial identity. Myth number 15, the children of fiery flames, or why the Celts were not a nation of red-headed giants. Ask anyone to describe a typical Celt, and you will likely hear a familiar set of characteristics: tall stature, fair skin, maybe some freckles, and of course, fiery red hair. The image of a red-headed Irish or Scottish person, hot-tempered and free-spirited, has become such a strong stereotype that it almost feels like historical fact. This picture travels from book to book, from movie to movie. Celtic, in popular consciousness, has nearly become synonymous with red-haired. We believe in this myth because it's simple, visually striking, and creates a clear, recognizable image of an entire ethnicity. This stereotype, rooted in ancient Roman descriptions and solidified by 19th-century racial theories, seems like an unshakable truth to us. However, once we look at modern genetics and archaeology, this monolithic red-haired image begins to break apart into a multitude of different shades. The idea of a red-haired Celtic race is purely a myth. First of all, as we already know, there was never a single Celtic nation. It was a conglomerate of tribes speaking related languages but having different origins and appearances. Secondly, genetic studies of modern inhabitants of countries considered Celtic, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, show that while red hair is more common there than anywhere else in the world, it still belongs to a minority. In Ireland, for example, redheads make up about 10% of the population. In Scotland, up to 13%. The vast majority of Irish and Scottish people have dark or light hair, ranging from black to blonde. There's no reason to believe the situation was different in ancient times. Ancient authors describing the Gauls or Britons likely recorded what seemed most unusual and exotic compared to the Mediterranean appearance they were familiar with. A warrior with fiery hair undoubtedly made a strong impression on a Roman, and that impression could easily have been extrapolated to the whole people. This is a classic case of generalization. In reality, the population of Western Europe, including areas where Celtic languages were spoken, was genetically very diverse. This is the result of thousands of years of migration and mixing of different population groups, starting from Paleolithic hunters to Indo-European settlers of the Bronze Age. The gene responsible for red hair is just one of many colors in this complex palette. The myth of red-haired Celts is a vivid example of how a chance observation, amplified by propaganda and pseudoscientific theories, can create a lasting but entirely false racial stereotype. Thus, the myth regarding the appearance of an entire people turned out to be just a stereotype born from selective perception. From the myths surrounding the body, let's travel back to Mesopotamia, to the myths born of the mind, specifically, the misconceptions about the essence of their greatest invention, writing. Myth number 16, writing for poets, or the real reason for the birth of cuneiform. Mesopotamia. Cuneiform. A word that conjures up images of wise priests inscribing lines of epic poetry, laws, and chronicles of kingdoms on damp clay. We imagine that writing, the greatest invention of humanity, emerged from a lofty need to capture myths, preserve heroic deeds for future generations, and document sacred texts. This idea seems logical and elevated. After all, what could be more important than passing on cultural memory? We believe that Sumerian scribes sat in temple libraries, reverently creating literature and history, driven by a quest for eternity. In our minds, the birth of writing represents an act of high spirit, a moment when humanity took a step from oral tradition to great literature. But the truth, as it often is much more mundane and down to earth. This brilliant intellectual achievement didn't arise from a desire to craft poems. It emerged from a far more pressing need, to count pots and sheep. Cuneiform was invented not by poets, but by accountants. The oldest known clay tablets from Uruk, dating back to the end of the 4th millennium BCE, are not epics or laws, they are boring, monotonous business records. 29,086 measures of barley received over 37 months. Signed, Kushim. Yes, one of the first names in human history that has come down to us isn't that of a king or hero, but likely that of a temple official or bookkeeper. The birth of writing was a direct result of the so-called urban revolution. The city-states of Sumer were becoming more intricate. Temples turned into gigantic economic centers, owning lands, herds, and workshops. They collected taxes in the form of grain, wool, and beer, and distributed them among priests, craftsmen, and soldiers. Keeping track of all these endless goods became impossible. An accounting tool was needed. Initially, these were simple pictograms, basic images representing objects. A bull's head symbolized a bull. A grain ear represented grain. Dots or lines indicated quantity beside them. But over time, the system grew more complex. The signs began to represent not only objects but also syllables and sounds. Images evolved into combinations of cuneiform impressions that were faster and easier to inscribe with a reed stylus on wet clay. Thus, cuneiform was born. It wasn't until centuries later, when writing became more advanced and flexible, that it began to be used for recording laws, myths, royal inscriptions, and literary works. But in its cradle, writing was a tool of bureaucracy, not inspiration. The Epic of Gilgamesh was inscribed nearly 1,000 years after those nameless Sumerian accountants began keeping their records. So, the greatest invention of the spirit was born out of the most material needs. From the prose of bureaucracy, we'll once again dive into the world of Japanese warriors to dismantle yet another myth surrounding their way of life, which seems to embody asceticism. Myth number 17. The warrior's asceticism, or the lie about the humble life of samurai, Japan. Bushido, the way of the warrior. This code of honor, we believe, dictated not only the samurai's rules of conduct in battle, but also their entire way of life. We picture the samurai as stoic, almost monk-like in armor. Their life is a constant training of mind and body, meditation, disdain for luxury and material goods. They live in simple houses with paper walls, eat a bowl of rice, wear modest clothing, and find the greatest joy in contemplating blooming cherry blossoms or writing haikus. This image of the ascetic warrior, detached from worldly distractions and wealth, is incredibly appealing. It paints a portrait of the perfect servant, for whom duty and honor are more important than personal comfort. We believe in this myth because it harmoniously complements other legends about samurai, about the soul in the sword, and readiness for seppuku. This creates a complete, rounded picture of a person who has transcended ordinary human weaknesses. However, this idealized portrait has little to do with reality, especially during the peak of samurai culture. In fact, samurai, particularly from the upper class, were anything but ascetics. They were the ruling class, the elite, and they fully enjoyed the fruits of their status. Their lives were filled with luxury, intrigue, and the pursuit of exquisite pleasures. During the Muromachi period, and particularly in the peaceful Edo era, samurai were the main trendsetters and consumers of luxury goods. They constructed magnificent castles and palaces with walls adorned in gold. They wore expensive silk kimonos and competed in the sophistication of their armor, which often served more as works of art than actual battle gear. They were passionate collectors, gathering rare and expensive Chinese ceramics for tea ceremonies, paintings, and calligraphy. They threw lavish feasts, held poetic tournaments, and enjoyed performances of no and kabuki theater. Many were well-known aesthetes, gourmets, and art connoisseurs. Yes, the Bushido Code, which, by the way, was fully formulated and recorded only in peacetime as an idealization of the past, spoke about modesty and disdain for money. But in practice, this often just meant disdain for dirty trade, not for spending money received as rice stipends from their lords. Many samurai lived beyond their means, accruing massive debts to merchant lenders they looked down upon, yet couldn't live without. The image of the ascetic warrior is more of a philosophical ideal drawn from Zen Buddhism, which was popular among samurai communities, but it rarely materialized in everyday life. Thus, the myth of the samurai's modesty hides the reality of a privileged class that valued luxury and beauty just as much as bravery and loyalty. From myths about daily life, we'll dive into the world of Celtic beliefs to bust one of the darkest and most persistent myths tied to their religion. Myth number 18, the bloody gods of the groves, or the truth about human sacrifices among the Celts. Picture this, an oak grove shrouded in mist. In the center stands a massive woven figure resembling a human. Inside, in cramped cages, people, men, women, and children, are thrashing about and screaming. A druid, dressed in white, holds a torch to the figure, and the monstrous idol bursts into flames, transforming into a gigantic funeral pyre. This chilling image, the Wicker Man, has become synonymous with Celtic religious practices. It has firmly embedded itself in our collective mind as evidence of their shocking cruelty and barbarism. We're led to believe that human sacrifices were a commonplace and widespread occurrence among the Celts, with their gods demanding a constant supply of blood. We buy into this myth because it was crafted and repeated by authoritative ancient writers, especially Julius Caesar, and because it fits perfectly into the narrative of wild barbarians opposing the civilized Romans. This shocking image sticks in our minds, making the Romans took this exceptional phenomenon, or even just the rumor of it, and turned it into a commonplace idea, creating a dark myth that outlasted both their empire and the Celts themselves. So, the most terrifying ritual of the Celts was likely a product of enemy propaganda. From gods demanding sacrifices, we shift back to Mesopotamia, where people believed they gazed at the stars with a single aim, to predict their fate. Myth number 19. Stargazers, or what the Babylonians really studied the sky for, Mesopotamia. Babylonian astrology. These words conjure up an image of a Chaldean priest at the top of a ziggurat, staring into the night sky, studying the planetary movements to create a horoscope for the king or foretell the outcome of an upcoming battle. We tend to think of the Babylonians as the first and foremost astrologers of the ancient world, believing that all their astronomy was focused on one single goal, predicting the future. The terms Chaldean and astrologer have become synonymous for centuries. We believe in this myth because it has deeply embedded itself into our culture. The idea that the positions of the stars influence human fate originated there, in Mesopotamia, and has survived to this day in the form of newspaper horoscopes. It seems to us that the Babylonians looked to the sky not out of scientific curiosity, but solely out of superstitious desire to uncover what was predetermined. But this view oversimplifies and distorts the true goals and achievements of Babylonian celestial science. The truth is that what we call astrology was only one, and not the most important, part of their grand project to study the cosmos. For the Babylonians, the sky wasn't just a book of destinies, it was the embodiment of divine order. They believed that the gods, having created the world, established a perfect harmony within it, most vividly expressed through the regular, cyclic movements of celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the planets. Thus, the main task of the priest astronomers was not so much to predict the future as to observe, measure, and calculate these cycles. Their goal was to understand the divine blueprint, to see the perfect mathematics underlying the universe. They were true scientists. For centuries, they kept meticulous records of observations, noting on clay tablets the positions of the planets, the times of rising and setting, and the dates of eclipses. From these enormous datasets, they made incredible discoveries. They accurately calculated the lengths of the month and the year, created complex mathematical models to predict the movements of the moon and planets, and learned to forecast solar and lunar eclipses. This was not mysticism, but the highest mathematics of their time. Astrological omens were more of a byproduct of the scientific endeavor. Importantly, Babylonian astrology was not personal, it was state-oriented. The priests predicted not the fate of an individual, but the fate of the nation, the king, and the harvest. Unusual celestial phenomena, comets, eclipses, atypical planetary alignments, were seen as signs from the gods, warning the king of imminent dangers, war, epidemics, flooding. This was an early warning system, not a fatalistic horoscope. The idea of creating personal horoscopes based on one's birth date emerged much later, during the Hellenistic period, influenced by Greek thought. Thus, the Babylonians were not so much astrologers in the modern sense, but the founding fathers of scientific astronomy, for whom studying the sky was a way to understand divine harmony. From this celestial order, we'll shift our focus to the ground, to Japan, to dispel the myth of its unshakable social hierarchy and discover that the path to the top was even open to the lowest ranks. Myth number 20, Unbreakable Walls of Class, or the story of a peasant who became the ruler of Japan. The era of samurai in Japan is often seen as a society with a rigid, impenetrable caste system. At the top are the noble warrior samurai, below them are the peasants, then the artisans, and at the very bottom are the despised merchants. Born into one class, a person was doomed to die in it. Social mobility seems impossible. Especially unimaginable is the idea of a peasant rising to the highest level of power. This image of a strict, hierarchical society, where one's birth determines everything, is deeply ingrained in our minds. We believe this myth because it fits our general idea of feudalism as a static, unchanging system. It paints a picture of submission and predetermined paths, where everyone knows their place from birth to death. But Japan's history offers at least one stunning example that shatters this myth. It's the story of a man who didn't just rise from the bottom, but became the actual ruler of the entire country. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was born in the mid-16th century into a poor peasant family. In his youth, he was a simple servant, even a sandal-bearer for an ambitious daimyo named Oda Nobunaga. He had no noble name, no education, and no land. The only things he possessed were a sharp mind, incredible energy, and a talent for getting along with people. During the tumultuous Sengoku period, when the old order was collapsing and talent and loyalty were all that mattered, that was enough. Step by step, showcasing acts of bravery in battles and remarkable administrative skills in peacetime, Hideyoshi climbed the ranks. He became one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. After Nobunaga was betrayed and killed by his own vassal, it was Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant, who avenged his lord, defeated all his enemies, and completed the task Nobunaga had started, uniting Japan under a single rule. He couldn't become a shogun since noble lineage was required for that, but he took the title of Kampaku, regent, making him the absolute ruler of the country. He built grand castles, implemented reforms, organized a census, and even attempted to invade Korea. This man, who started his journey as a sandal-bearer, died at the peak of power, commanding the most esteemed samurai clans. His story is not just an exception that proves the rule. It's evidence that even in the most hierarchical society, talent and luck could break down any social barriers. Interestingly, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who came from humble beginnings, issued a decree at the end of his rule that strictly prohibited farmers from carrying weapons or moving up to the samurai class, effectively closing the very social lift that had elevated him. The story of a peasant's son becoming a dictator shows that reality was much more dynamic and complex than the frozen myth of castes. Now, from social myths, let's turn back to the Celts to tackle one of the most tangled myths regarding their origins. Myth number 21, the lost tribe of Israel, or the outlandish theory of Celtic roots. In the 19th century, during the height of nationalism and amateur archaeology, one of the strangest and most enduring pseudo-historical theories emerged in Britain, the theory of British Israelism. The core idea was that the peoples of northwestern Europe, primarily the British and consequently their ancestors, the Celts and Anglo-Saxons, were actually direct descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel who were taken captive by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC. According to this theory, the exiled Israelites didn't disappear. They moved north and west, through the Caucasus and Europe, eventually settling in the British Isles and becoming the very Celts and Saxons. This idea, as crazy as it seems today, gained immense popularity back then. It flattered the imperial self-image of the British, turning them into not just a great nation, but a chosen people, inheritors of biblical promises. We might laugh at this today, but hundreds of thousands of people genuinely believed it, finding evidence in the Bible, in the similarity of some place names, and in national symbols. This myth is a vivid example of how people search for great and glorious ancestors to justify their present. Debunking this myth doesn't require complicated evidence. It's quite simple and rests on 3 pillars: linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. First, the languages. Celtic languages, like Irish, Welsh, and Gaulish, belong to the Indo-European language family, just like Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and Slavic languages. Ancient Hebrew, the language spoken by the Israelites, belongs to a completely different Semitic language family, which also includes Arabic and Aramaic. There is absolutely nothing in common between these families in terms of grammar or core vocabulary. No serious linguist has ever supported the idea of any kinship between them. Second, archaeology. The archaeological record of migrations in Europe is well studied. We can trace the spread of Celtic material culture, known as Latin culture, from its center in the Alps across Europe. There are no archaeological signs of a mass migration of a Middle Eastern people through Eurasia to the British Isles during the time in question. This is pure fantasy with no real evidence to back it up. Thirdly, let's talk about genetics. Modern genetic research shows that most of the gene pool of the British Isles has European roots, tracing back to the Mesolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Ages. There's no evidence of mass migration from the Middle East during the Iron Age. The theory of British Israelism is a classic example of pseudoscience based on random coincidences, strained interpretations, and complete disregard for scientific data. This myth is born not from history, but from ideology. So, the attempt to find biblical ancestors turned into one of the most notorious historical curiosities. From the myths about the origins of nations, let's head back to Mesopotamia and explore the myths surrounding one of the most fundamental concepts of our civilization: time. Myth number 22, the invention of time, or what the Mesopotamians really did with clocks and calendars. Mesopotamia. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, 360 degrees in a circle. Where do these strange, non-round numbers come from? The answer we typically hear is simple. It's all from Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, or the Babylonians. We imagine a brilliant ancient sage sitting by the Euphrates, deciding to divide time and space this way. We're told they used a base 60 counting system, and we inherited this odd division from them. This idea has become almost an axiom. In any popular article about the history of time, you'll read about the great legacy of Mesopotamia, which gifted us with hours and minutes. We believe in this myth because it offers a straightforward and clear explanation for why our time measurement system seems so illogical compared to the decimal system we use for everything else. But this explanation, while essentially true, overlooks one crucial detail that completely changes the picture. The Mesopotamians did use a base 60 system for their mathematical and astronomical calculations. However, they never divided a day into 24 hours or an hour into 60 minutes. That system came much later. The truth is that the Babylonians divided the day, the full cycle from one sunrise to the next, into 12 double hours, kaspu. One such kaspu was equivalent to 2 of our modern hours. This made sense because the sun would travel across the sky in 12 such segments during a day. But they had no division into minutes and seconds at all. They used smaller units, but those weren't connected to the number 60. So where did our familiar system come from? It's the result of a complex blend of several cultures. The idea of dividing the light and dark portions of the day into 12 parts came from ancient Egypt. The Egyptians used sundials and noticed that the shadow moved through 10 segments during the day, plus one segment each for morning and evening twilight. This is how the concept of 12 daylight hours and, by analogy, 12 nighttime hours came to be. However, the length of these hours constantly changed depending on the time of year. During summer, daylight hours were long and nighttime hours were short, and vice versa. It was the Greek astronomers, particularly Hipparch in the 2nd century BCE, who first combined these two systems. They took the Egyptian idea of 24 hours in a day, but made them uniform and consistent for easier calculations. To achieve more precise measurements of angles and time, they divided the hour in a way similar to degrees, using the handy Babylonian base 60 system, into 60 first small parts, partes minutae primae, which became our minutes, and 60 second small parts, partes minutae secundae, which became our seconds. So, our system of measuring time is not purely a Mesopotamian invention, but a complex blend of Babylonian mathematics, Egyptian practices, and Greek scientific thought. Even in such a fundamental concept as time, we witness not the brilliant insight of one people, but the result of a long and intricate cultural dialogue. From measuring time, let's move to measuring value in Japan and debunk the myth that this country has been isolated from the global economy for centuries. Myth number 23, a country behind closed doors, or the falsehood of Japan's complete isolation during the Edo period. The policy known as sakoku means country in chains. This term, describing the era of the Tokugawa shogunate from the mid-17th to the mid-19th century, paints a picture in our minds of Japan's complete and airtight isolation from the outside world. We are told that the shoguns, fearing foreign influence and the spread of Christianity, shut the doors of their country. Japanese people were forbidden to leave the islands under the threat of death, and foreigners, with very few exceptions, were banned from entering. Trade was nearly halted. For over 200 years, Japan fell into a lethargic slumber, consciously shutting itself off from the rapidly developing world. This image of a closed country has become one of the central myths about Japan. We believe it because it dramatically explains both the uniqueness of Japanese culture, which supposedly preserved itself in this isolated space, and the subsequent shock of encountering the West faced with Commodore Perry's black ships. But this notion of complete isolation is a significant exaggeration that doesn't align with historical reality. The shogunate's policies were not aimed at total isolation, but rather at establishing a strict state monopoly over all foreign relations. The shoguns didn't close the country, they took all its windows and doors under their direct control. The truth is that Japan during the Edo period maintained active, albeit highly regulated, trade and diplomatic relations with several countries. There were at least 4 windows to the outside world. The main one was the port of Nagasaki, where the Dutch trading post was located on the artificial island of the Jima. Through the Dutch, Japan received not just European goods like textiles, sugar, and books, but more importantly, valuable information. The so-called Dutch learning, or rangaku, which included medicine, astronomy, and military tactics, was actively studied by Japanese scholars. Nagasaki was a hub for lively trade with China. Another avenue of connection was through Korea, via the So clan from Tsushima Island. The third route was trade with the Ryukyu Kingdom, modern-day Okinawa, which in turn traded with China. Lastly, there were contacts with the Ainu, the indigenous people of Hokkaido, through the Matsumaya clan. So, Japan wasn't completely cut off from the world, it just filtered incoming information and goods very carefully. The shoguns were well aware of global events, including the Opium Wars in China and the rise of European powers. When Perry's ships arrived on Japan's shores, it wasn't entirely shocking for the Japanese elite. They understood that a confrontation was inevitable, sooner or later. The myth of total isolation was partly constructed by Western historians to emphasize Japan's backwardness and the awakening role of the West. This closed country, was actually watching the world closely through well-guarded windows. From the myths of national borders, let's transition to the myths of cultural boundaries, into the Celtic world, to discover that their famous patterns have a very different origin than what we attribute to them. Myth number 24. Art from the Mist, or non-Celtic roots of Celtic patterns, Celts. Complex, endless interweavings of lines, knots with no beginning or end, spirals, triskelies, stylized animal representations. When we see these patterns, we instantly think, this is Celtic art. They adorn jewelry, book covers, and tattoos. They've become a visual symbol of all things Celtic, a badge of belonging to Irish, Scottish, or Welsh culture. We believe this is ancient, indigenous art, born in misty valleys and sacred groves long before Christianity arrived. We think that these intricate ornaments are a direct legacy of the Druids, encoded symbols of their cosmology, embodying the infinity and cyclical nature of existence. This myth is incredibly appealing because it gives these beautiful patterns deep, mystical, and pre-Christian significance. But this view is a major misconception, rooted in a mix of different times and cultures. The truth is that the style we now call Celtic art, or insular art, has no direct connection to the ancient, pre-Christian Celts of the Iron Age. The art of the ancient Gauls and Britons, known as Latin culture, was completely different. It was more fluid, asymmetrical, often used plant motifs and curved lines, but lacked the complex, mathematically precise geometric interweavings we associate with Celtic patterns. The style we know today is a product of synthesis that emerged much later during the early Middle Ages, roughly from the 7th to the 9th century AD in the Christian era. And it didn't come about in isolation. It was the result of close interactions among several cultures. The main creators of this style were Irish and Pictish monks who worked in monastery scriptoria. They took some elements from ancient Celtic art, like spirals, but combined them with completely different traditions. The intricate woven patterns, or knots, were borrowed from the art of Germanic peoples, especially the Anglo-Saxons, with whom the Irish monks had strong contacts. The techniques of cloisonné enamel and metalwork also showed a significant Germanic influence. Moreover, some motifs, such as stylized lions or grapevines, were drawn from Mediterranean, Coptic, and Near Eastern art, samples of which made their way into Irish monasteries along with Christian texts. The masterpieces of this style, like the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospel, are not pagan artifacts. They are remarkable monuments of Christian art created to glorify God. They are the result of not isolation, but incredible cultural openness and synthesis. So, the art we thought was the epitome of Celtic uniqueness turned out to be the product of a complex international dialogue. From human-made artworks, we now return to Mesopotamia, to nature's greatest work, which we believe was paradise on earth. Myth number 25. The earthly paradise of Mesopotamia, or why the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are probably a phantom. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Our imagination paints a grand, multi-tiered structure, a true green oasis in the middle of a dusty city. Exotic plants, flowers, and trees hang down from terraces supported by tall columns. An elaborate system of pumps lifts water from the Euphrates to the very top, where it flows down in streams and waterfalls, irrigating this man-made paradise. This image has become a symbol of luxury and engineering genius of the ancient East. We believe in the existence of this wonder without a doubt, since it's included in the canonical list that was created by ancient authors. Stories about gardens built by King Nebuchadnezzar II for his Median wife, who longed for the green hills of her homeland, seem absolutely credible to us. But here's the catch. Despite all its fame, the Hanging Gardens are the most mysterious and elusive of all the wonders of the world. There are compelling reasons to believe that they never existed in Babylon. First of all, there isn't a single mention of any grand gardens in any of the thousands of Babylonian cuneiform texts that have survived. King Nebuchadnezzar left behind numerous inscriptions proudly detailing all his building projects, temples, palaces, city walls. He describes them in the smallest detail. But there is not a word about the Hanging Gardens. This silence is deafening. First, The famous historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BC, describes the city in detail, including its walls and temples, but he doesn't mention any gardens. Second, all the descriptions of the gardens we do have were made by much later Greek and Roman authors, like Strabo or Diodorus Siculus, who had never actually been to Babylon and based their accounts on hearsay and stories. Archaeological digs in Babylon have also produced no convincing evidence. They found ruins of a massive structure with vaulted basements, which some have tried to identify as the foundation of the gardens, but that theory remains highly disputed. There is an alternative, much more plausible theory suggested by British Assyriologist Stephanie Daly. She proposes that the Hanging Gardens actually existed, but not in Babylon. Instead, they were in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, built by King Sennacherib 300 years earlier. This theory is backed by Assyrian texts that describe the construction of luxurious palace gardens, along with bas-reliefs depicting similar tiered structures with trees. It's possible that Greek authors simply mixed up the two great Mesopotamian capitals and mistakenly moved the Assyrian wonder to the more famous Babylon. So, one of the most famous wonders of the world may have been nothing more than a historical mirage, a case of mistaken geolocation. From architectural wonders, let's switch gears to the world of Japanese martial arts to debunk the myth of the deadliest martial art. Myth number 26, the deadly touch, or why karate was not originally an art of killing, Japan. Karate. In our minds, this word is linked to lightning-fast, lethal strikes. We picture a master who can break a stack of bricks or take someone down with a single precise blow of the sword hand, shuto. Martial arts movies have created this image of karate as the ultimate weapon, a fighting system designed for killing. This myth is supported by stories that karate originated in Okinawa as a secret art of farmers who were forbidden to carry weapons, forcing them to turn their bodies into deadly machines to fight off the occupying Japanese samurai. This tale of a secret self-defense system for an oppressed people is quite romantic and dramatic, but this version is, to put it mildly, inaccurate. Originally, karate, or what it was called te or tote, Chinese hand, was not at all what it seems today. The truth is, it was neither secret nor peasant-based, nor, especially, an art of killing. The roots of karate lie in the synthesis of local Okinawan hand-to-hand combat techniques and various styles of Chinese martial arts, kung fu. Okinawa, being a key trading hub in the Ryukyu Kingdom, maintained close ties with China for centuries. Many Okinawan aristocrats, not farmers, traveled to China to learn and brought back knowledge, including martial arts. Originally, te was a comprehensive self-improvement system that included not just fighting techniques, but also gymnastics, breathing exercises, and meditation. Its main goal wasn't to defeat an opponent, but to enhance health, develop discipline, and strengthen character. While the combat aspect definitely existed, it focused on self-defense rather than aggression. The idea that karate was invented to fight samurai is also a myth. Although samurai from the Satsuma clan did conquer Okinawa in the early 17th century, there is no historical evidence of mass peasant uprisings using karate. Martial arts were primarily practiced among the Okinawan nobility, not the peasants. The transformation of karate from a wellness system to what we know today occurred much later, in the early 20th century, when it was included in physical education programs in Okinawan schools. It was then that masters like Gichin Funakoshi systematized, simplified, and made it more accessible for widespread learning. When Funakoshi moved to Japan, he changed the kanji for to, China, to a homonym kanji for kata, empty, turning Chinese hand into empty hand, which resonated better with the spirit of Japanese nationalism at the time. So, the martial art we see as the pinnacle of lethal efficiency was born as a system of health and spiritual self-improvement. From martial arts, we'll return to the Celtic world to tackle a myth that underpins one of the most popular modern holidays. Myth number 27. Halloween's pagan roots that don't exist. Celts. Halloween. Carved pumpkins, witch and ghost costumes, kids trick-or-treating. For most people, it's a fun modern celebration, but many believe they know its true, ancient, and dark roots. We are told that Halloween is a direct descendant of the ancient Celtic pagan festival of Samhain. According to legend, on the night of Samhain, the boundary between the living and the dead became thin. Ancestor spirits and all sorts of creatures roamed the earth, and to ward off evil spirits and appease the good ones, the Celts lit bonfires, donned frightening masks, and left offerings. This myth of a direct connection between Samhain and Halloween is incredibly popular. It lends an air of ancient mystique and mystery to the modern celebration. We believe it because it's a beautiful and logical story that connects us to a distant and enigmatic past. However, when historians and folklorists begin to break down this theory, they find it built on a very shaky foundation. There is almost no direct evidence that ancient Celts celebrated Samhain in the way it's described in popular articles. Yes, Samhain was one of the 4 major celebrations of the Celtic year, marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark, winter half of the year. This was an important time, but our knowledge of specific rituals is quite limited and based on much later Irish sagas recorded by Christian monks who might have distorted or misinterpreted ancient customs. The idea that this was a universal celebration of the dead is largely a modern reconstruction created by folklorists in the 19th and 20th centuries. When it comes to the features of modern Halloween, their origins are much more recent and complex. For instance, the tradition of trick-or-treat didn't come from Druids, but from the medieval British practice of souling. On All Souls' Day, which falls on November 2nd, poor people would go from house to house begging for soul cakes in exchange for prayers for the souls of the host's deceased relatives. The pumpkin lantern, known as the jack-o'-lantern, is actually an American invention from the 19th century, replacing the Irish custom of carving lanterns from turnips or swede. Halloween itself, All Hallows' Eve, is a Christian holiday, the night before All Saints' Day, celebrated on November 1st. This celebration was established by the Pope in the 8th century, possibly to overlay and Christianize some local pagan traditions, but there is no direct connection to the Celtic celebration of the dead as we envision it today. Modern Halloween is a complex cultural blend of Irish folklore, British traditions, and American commercial culture. So, the holiday we thought was an ancient pagan ritual turned out to be a much younger and more complex cultural phenomenon. From the myths surrounding these celebrations, let's travel back to Mesopotamia to debunk the myth of the oldest law, which was neither the oldest nor a law in our understanding. Myth number 28, the first law, or why the Code of Hammurabi was not the first, Mesopotamia. The stele with Hammurabi's laws. We've talked about it before, dispelling the myth of the principle of an eye for an eye. But there's another equally fundamental myth related to this artifact. It is almost always presented as the, quote, first legal code in human history. This phrase bounces from textbook to textbook, from encyclopedia to encyclopedia. Hammurabi appears to us as the Moses of Mesopotamia, the first great legislator who brought order from chaos to his people. This idea is very convenient. It creates a clear starting point in the history of law, a sort of 0 kilometer from which all subsequent jurisprudence can be measured. We believe it because it's simple, beautiful, and adds even more greatness to the figure of Hammurabi. However, this statement is historically inaccurate. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1750 BCE, is undoubtedly one of the most complete and well-preserved, but it is far from the first. Archaeologists have discovered at least 3 earlier Mesopotamian legal collections. The oldest known laws today are the laws of Ur-Nammu, the king of the city of Ur, and founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. This code was created around the 21st century BCE, which is over 300 years before the famous Code of Hammurabi. Although we only have fragments of it, it's clear that this was a comprehensive code covering various aspects of life, from family law to punishments for crimes. Interestingly, the laws of Ur-Nammu were much more humane than those of Hammurabi. Instead of the principle of an eye for an eye, they often favored monetary fines and compensation. Besides the laws of Ur-Nammu, there are also the laws of Lipit Ishtar from Isin and the laws from the city of Eshnunna, which also predate Hammurabi's code. However, there's an even deeper misunderstanding. Modern legal historians are increasingly concluding that these codes weren't laws in our sense, that is, mandatory regulations. They were likely collections of model court decisions, sort of textbooks for judges or propaganda pieces aimed at showcasing the wisdom and fairness of the ruling king. The king was, in a way, telling his people, "Look, here are the just decisions I make. I am the king of justice." Real justice in Mesopotamia relied primarily on customary law, traditions, and decisions from local courts and councils of elders, rather than blindly following the text of a code. So, the most famous law in history wasn't the first one, and perhaps not even a law at all. From the myths of laws governing people, we move to the myth of a code supposedly governing samurai, Bushido. Myth number 29, the ancient code of honor, or why Bushido is a modern invention, Japan. Bushido, the way of the warrior. For us, this word is synonymous with samurai ethics. We picture an ancient, unwritten code passed down through generations for 1,000 years. The 7 virtues, justice, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty, seem to be carved into the hearts of every samurai since time immemorial. Bushido appears to us as a Japanese version of a chivalric code, a strict set of rules that defined every step of a warrior, making him who he was. We buy into this myth of Bushido being ancient and unchangeable because it creates an idealized, noble picture of the samurai, free from the dirt and brutality of real war. But the truth is that the Bushido we know today isn't an ancient code. It's largely a modern invention, specifically, a construct from the late 19th to early 20th century. The term Bushido does appear in some texts from the Edo period, but it was neither widely accepted nor systematic. Different samurai clans had their own codes and guidelines, known as kakun, which could vary widely from one another. There was no single, universal code for all samurai. The idea of Bushido as a unified ethical system was popularized and essentially created by a man named Nitobe Inazo. In 1900, this Japanese diplomat and thinker wrote a book in English called Bushido, the Soul of Japan. His goal was to explain the moral foundations of Japanese culture to a Western audience that, after rapid modernization, found it confusing and seemingly lacking in spiritual direction. Nitobe blended fragmented ideas from Confucianism, Buddhism, and Shinto with idealized views of samurai history and European concepts of chivalry and gentlemanly behavior, presenting this as an ancient and unchanging code. His book was a huge hit in the West and, ironically, was later translated into Japanese where it gained popularity in Japan itself. It perfectly fit into the ideology of militaristic Japan in the early 20th century, which craved a heroic national myth. So, the construct made for a Western audience became part of Japanese national identity. Thus, the code we viewed as the ancient heart of samurai culture turned out to be largely a product of the modern era, created for export. Now, let's move from the myth that shaped the nation to the last, 30th myth, which concerns the very essence of Celtic identity and their relationship with their past. Myth number 30, the eternal memory of the people, or why the Celts didn't want to remember their history. We tend to think that every nation strives to preserve its history. We admire the Egyptians, who covered temple walls with hieroglyphs, and the Romans, who created multi-volume histories. However, when we turn to the Celts, we encounter a paradox, a highly developed civilization that left behind almost no written historical records. This gave rise to the legend of Druids as keepers who deliberately prohibited writing sacred knowledge and history, preferring oral transmission to train memory and preserve the sacredness of knowledge. This idea paints a picture of a people who carried their entire history in their heads through endless poems and genealogies passed down orally. We believe in this myth because it is romantic and explains the lack of written sources not as backwardness, but as a unique spiritual stance. But this explanation is likely fundamentally flawed. The truth may be that the Celts didn't write down their history not because they couldn't or didn't want to for sacred reasons, but because their understanding of time and history was fundamentally different from ours. For us, history is a linear process, a sequence of unique individual events leading from the past to the future. In the Celtic worldview, much like in many other traditional societies, time was cyclical. What mattered were not unique events, but recurring patterns, the eternal cycle of seasons, life, and death. They were interested not in what happened once, but in what happens all the time. Their myths don't tell stories of historical kings, but of archetypal heroes whose deeds repeat in every generation. Genealogies weren't just about recording the past, they were about claiming status and land rights in the present, and they could easily change or be rewritten depending on political circumstances. They lived not in history, but in myth. They didn't need to write down the past because they constantly relived it through rituals and celebrations. Oral tradition wasn't just a way to share information, it was a mechanism for continuously recreating the world. Forgetting was just as important as remembering, as it allowed them to adapt the past to the needs of the present. The idea of recording history in the way we understand it was likely foreign and uninteresting to them. They didn't aim to immortalize a one-time event, as only what was eternal and recurring held true value. Thus, the lack of written history among the Celts wasn't a sign of weakness, but a reflection of a completely different view of the world and time. We've come a long way, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the misty hills of Ireland, peeling back layer after layer of history. Each time, behind the convenient yet flat myth, we uncovered a rich, complex, and much more captivating truth. History isn't a frozen monument. It's a living dialogue filled with mistakes, misconceptions, and amazing discoveries.